In this series, I will teach you how to use Unreal Engine with no previous experience. No previous designing or programming skills required whatsoever. It is recommended that you know a little about computers, but it's not a requirement. Unreal Engine 5 is a free tool that can literally be used to create anything. Anything from movies, games, apps, software. The sky is not even the limit. It comes with pre-made samples that can be further developed. They're called starter packs, and it's very useful when you want to create a specific game, like a third-person game or a first-person shooter. For video games, we only have 5 starter packs, which is a downgrade from the previous Unreal Engine 4. I am not very happy with that, to be honest. So you can also create a project in Unreal Engine 4 and convert it to Unreal Engine 5. I will create a third-person project in this series, and I would recommend that you do the same for it to be easier to follow along. Give your project a name and make sure that you have selected blueprints and starter content to be checked. We can also set the target hardware quality preset and whether we want ray tracing or not. When you're ready, press Create Project. This is the default Unreal Engine 5 look. I prefer to use the Unreal Engine 4 layout since it's easier to work with. We can set our preferred workspace look by going into Window, Load Layout, UE4 Classic Layout. This can always be changed. You can even create your own workspace by tweaking the looks of the engine. This is my saved mobile app layout. The engine might look overwhelming at first, but trust me, when you get comfortable, it's all going to be fine. This episode will be about navigating through the engine so that things make a little bit of sense. If you don't understand everything, that's completely fine. I will elaborate on most of this the rest of this series. Let's start with the viewport. This is where you can see your game world, your levels, characters. You will be testing your game, looking for bugs, etc. You can move around in the viewport by using your mouse and keyboard. You can also move objects around, scale them, rotate them, delete them, add them, pretty much everything. Up here, you can choose what tool to use. If you want to rotate, you select the Rotate tool. If you want to scale, you select the Scale tool. You also have a Select tool. With this, you can only select and nothing else. You can also tweak the object size, rotation, or position in the Details panel. This panel appears when you have selected an object. To save, press the Save All button in the bottom panel. There are other ways to save in the engine, but this is the most reliable. You can also choose what objects you want to save. This is because there are times where you don't want to save stuff. For example, when moving stuff around and you're not sure whether you want it there or not. You also have the option to choose grids up here. Grids make sure that you adjust an object's properties evenly. So, for example, if you want to move your object by 500 centimeters each time, you can select the 500 on the location grid. You can do the same for rotation and scale as well. You can enable the grid to be on or off. This is useful when you want to have things even. I usually don't use grids when moving stuff around, but when I rotate an object, I always have the grid on. You can adjust the size of the viewport by clicking and dragging its corner. And if you want that to be permanent, you can save the layout. You can navigate in the viewport by pressing the right mouse button and move it around. You can zoom in or out with the mouse wheel. You can also move around by using the WASD keys and E to go up or Q to go down. There is also a camera icon up here. This is to adjust the viewport movement speed. You can also adjust the speed while moving with the WASD keys and using the mouse scroll wheel. Hold in the Alt key and use the right mouse button to navigate around to the middle. This is very useful when you're navigating around a mesh. In the right corner, we have the outliner. The outliner shows all the actors in the current level. You can make this panel bigger as well. You can organize them in folders or different orders. If you don't know where a certain object is, you can press it in here and it will be selected. You can also choose to hide an object in the viewport, but keep in mind that it will be visible when you play the game. We can also delete it from our level by pressing the Delete button on our keyboard. Now, it will be gone when we play. We also have a Player Start object in here. This is where our player will start when we press play. We can move it around the level, of course, but what do you think would happen if we move this inside another object? Let's find out. The engine is smart enough to detect that the player shouldn't spawn in an object with collision and will move the player out of the way. You will also see that it says bad. Pretty cool, right? We can also put it up in the air. If we want to undo something in the engine, or with computers in general, press the Ctrl+Z button. This will undo what we have done. So if we move it 3 times, we undo 3 times. We can also redo if we regret what we undid by pressing Ctrl+Y. In some softwares, it will be Ctrl+Shift+Z. On the left side, we have things that affect our perspective and useful tools for navigation or game testing. If we press the Show button, we get a bunch of options. We can choose to enable or disable certain things in our game, like the clouds, for example, or the atmosphere. There are also things like bloom, grain, color grading, and so on. If you have tweaked a bunch of stuff and don't remember, but you want to set it back, you can press the Use Defaults button. It will set everything back to the default way. The Lit button is for different types of views. In wireframe mode, you only see the outline of every object. These settings are mainly for testing purposes, as there's a lot of testing and problem solving when making games. There's other options in here as well. The Perspective tab is used when you want to have a certain perspective of your game. If you want to create a top-down game or maybe a 2D game, you can use these perspectives to get the right perspective instead of manually moving the camera. You can also use something called the Cinematic Viewport. This is a bit more badass. It makes your viewport look a bit more cinematic. The last tab is for testing purposes. Things like viewing your frame rate, changing the field of view in the viewport, setting bookmarks, and other stuff you don't need right now. In the Details panel, we can tweak more settings than just its location and looks. Again, you can make the panel bigger by selecting the top and stretching it out like a rubber. We can add things to objects in the world by pressing the Add button. There are plenty of things to choose from, but you will most likely never do it this way. But it's good to know that you can. There are also a bunch of options to choose from in here. Again, most of which you won't need anytime soon. I will be going through the most important, starting off with visual objects or mesh. A mesh is a 3D object that has the shape of any geometry in the 3D world. Meshes are used to represent characters, environments, props, or anything that has a 3D form. We can change the current mesh by pressing here. We will see the meshes that are in our current project, and since we have Show Engine Content on, we can see the engine content meshes as well. I'm going to set this to be a chair. Every mesh in the engine will be using something called materials. A material is the texture and color of a mesh. A tree will be using a tree material that consists of textures looking like wood, with the right colors as well. I can set this to be a rock texture, for example, and now it will look like a rock shaped like a chair. This current mesh has physics enabled. This means that it will react in a realistic way. It will have gravity, weight, and so on. If I turn this setting off, you will notice that it doesn't react that way anymore. You can also tweak the physics properties of the object. If you set the weight very low, it will have less resistance, and the outcome is pretty fun. You could make it fly away like an object in space or something by turning off the gravity. It's also possible to lock the object's plane. This means that if you, for example, only wanted to move forward and not in any other direction, you can lock the X and Z axis and it will only move on the Y axis. This could be useful with something like a platform. Then there's the collision. This is also going to be very important later on, but all you need to know right now is that the collision of an object is essentially a way to detect other objects in the world and how to react. So in this case, the collision will block the player collision and not let us walk through the chair. It's better to tweak the collision settings in the class properties, which I will talk about in the upcoming videos. Then lastly, you have the mesh shadow. Shadows will make your game look more realistic, but they also come with performance loss. The bigger the object, the more performance it will cost. But again, I will address this in the future. You can also set the object visibility in here. The rest of these settings are irrelevant for now, and even I don't use much of the stuff here. Now let's talk about the world settings. If you go to Window and press the World Settings button, you will see a bunch more options. These settings are for the world, like the sky color, light, clouds, fog, and so on. Again, you probably won't be doing most of the world tweaking here, but it's necessary to use sometimes. This setting is to decide how far to fall in order for your character to die. If I jump off the ledge here, it only takes about a second to die, or more specifically, I die when my character reaches -1000 on the z-axis in the level. We can change this to be greater. If I set this to around -10 million, I can keep going for a long time. You can also turn off this option so that the character doesn't die at all. Down here, you can also see how many objects aren't saved, and you can press this button to save as well. This thing down here is called a content browser. This is literally what it says where you browse the engine's content. The layout that we have set makes the content browser stick down here. If I change this back to the default Unreal style, the content browser comes and goes with the press of this button. We can also choose to have a content browser somewhere else, like in the side panel, or maybe as a separate window. Now we have the same content browser as the Unreal Engine 4 layout. We can literally set this anywhere. There is a settings button over here where you can set different kinds of properties. You can change the content browser list type or whether to show different types of stuff in here. There is an important option here that will be useful sometime, and that is the Show Engine Content. There are certain things like materials, sounds, meshes, and so on that are engine content and not local content. That means that the engine content is in the Unreal Engine program itself, whilst everything else we have here is from the third-person starter pack. If I turn off this option, you will see that a lot of materials have disappeared from the list. I like to keep this on since we have a lot more things to choose from. You can also choose to show plugins and other stuff. It's also possible to adjust the thumbnail size. Another thing to mention is that when you make these adjustments, you cannot use Ctrl-Z to undo these changes, so be careful. Up here, we have the content path. If I go into a folder somewhere and I copy this path, I can paste it back in and press Enter to come right back. You can also go back and forth from the path you are currently in, so if I press All, I will end up in that folder. You can also use these arrows to navigate back and forth from your previous folder location to your current one. It won't go in the folder content order, but in the order that you have entered the folders. If we right-click in the content browser, we get the option to add a bunch of different stuff. Don't be scared. By the end of this video series, you will have full control over it. We also have a search bar here, where we can search for whatever we need. If you right-click on a folder, you get certain options. One cool feature, which I wish I knew earlier, is to give the folder a color. This is very useful for proper organizing, and you're lucky because you learned it very early. We can also navigate through the content browser from this left panel here. With this Wi-Fi looking button, we can filter the content browser content. Useful if you're looking for a specific content type. You can import files by pressing the Import button or by dragging them directly into the game. If you press the Add button, you get the same menu as when we right-clicked in the content browser. Remember when we created this project and I told you do choose the third-person starter pack? Well, what if you wanted to add another one in here? You can actually do that by right-clicking or pressing the Add button and pressing the Add feature or Content Pack button. Pretty cool. I am not going to keep this for our project, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. I just wanted to show you. You can also create a new folder by right-clicking and pressing the New Folder button. Then we have the top panel. We can add a new level by pressing the File, New Level. Here you can choose between different types of levels. Only select the empty levels if you know what you're doing. That leaves us with basic and open world. This is the difference between the levels. Now we have created a new level, and you would think that you could just press the Save button, right? We haven't actually saved the level anywhere. To do that, press the File button again, and select the Save Current Level as button. Here you can choose the name of the level and where you want your level to be stored. You can also create a new folder in here, but you can't set the color from here. If I close and reopen the engine, you will see that we will spawn in the other map. This is because the level has not been set as the default map. We can open the level either by double-clicking on it in the content browser, or by pressing File, Open Level, and selecting it from there. You can also set favorite levels and some other self-explanatory stuff in here. When you press the Edit button, some settings won't be available unless you select an object in your level. You can cut an object, which would equal to Control X, or copy, which would be Control C. You can also access the undo history if you ever need that. That is a list of your recent actions that you can undo or redo. You also have the editor preferences, project settings, and plugins. The editor preferences will also take you to the settings, but to the appearance section. In the project settings, there are a bunch of options that look very confusing and intimidating, but fear not. The Struggle Made Simple hero is here to save you from confusion. Remember when I said that the open world level didn't open because we never set it to the main level? If we go into the Maps and Modes section of the project settings, you can change that. The Editor Startup map is the map that opens up when we open the project, and the Game Default map is the level to open when the actual game is being opened by the gamer. This would be the main menu in 99% of cases. Then lastly, we have the Plugins section. I wonder what this is for. Just kidding. In here, you can search for all types of plugins, everything from water to Android game required plugins. You would just set the plugin to be checked or enabled and restart the engine. I will go more in depth over this in the future. Then we have the Tools section. Here we have all sorts of tools, everything from game debugging to memory management. You also have bookmarks and converting options. This is too advanced for us right now, so let's move on. The Build section is where everything building related is done. Building refers to the process of compiling and preparing various elements of your game or project for execution. It involves multiple steps that optimize, generate, and finalize the assets, lighting, and code, making them ready for play or distribution. The Select tab is just for selecting certain things or unselecting them. The Actor tab is object-specific, or should I say, actor-specific. I explain these terms in part 0 of this series, so be sure to check that out. With this menu, we can edit the actor in different ways. We could browse to it if we didn't know where it was in the level, and a bunch of more stuff. Then lastly, we have the Help tab. This refers to documentation and other stuff you might need to make your project. Then we have the Viewport top panel. If we press the Platform drop-down menu, you will see a bunch of options. This is related to compiling and packaging of our game for different target hardware. If we press these 3 dots, we can choose what platform we want to simulate. New Editor is for computer games. Mobile is for mobile games. It might take a long time to load the first time you do this. You will see that the graphics and lights and controls are different. This is what it would look like on a phone. This button is used for making cutscenes or videos in the engine. This one is used for blueprint-related stuff, or to change the game mode. I will talk more about game modes in future videos. You can also use this button to add stuff in the game. We also have this button here that is currently on selection mode. This drop-down menu has a bunch of useful modes that you can use. Like the landscape mode, this can be used to create large maps or mountain-type terrain. There are also tools for other things in the engine like animation, brush editing, etc. And then lastly, we have this left menu over here that only shows when you use the Unreal Engine 4 layout. I rarely use this, but it can be useful for simple tasks. You can drag in all sorts of class types in the level: lights, triggers, cubes, player start, and much more. Now you know how to navigate through Unreal Engine's main content. You won't remember everything just by watching this video once, but now you can have a reference whenever you need it. I will go much more in depth through the program in the rest of the series and do my best to help you understand everything.